I know we covered engine bay prep in number 1, I believe it was, but this is going to go into what we actually need to do to get the bell housing on, to do the engine mounts, talking through power steering lines, those kind of bits and pieces, as well as the clutch master cylinder adjustment that we required to do, and we may incorporate the fuel system in the engine bay into this video, or we may keep it as a separate fuel system video. Yeah, so we'll go through, we'll work out what brake lines, where they need to move, how we're going to move them. We'll get this bell housing off to start, and from there, yeah, that gives us a bit more room around the driver's side chassis rail, which allows us to move those fuel lines and brake lines to where they're not going to get damaged by the exhaust. We'll also mount up these engine mounts because they go on prior to putting the motor in, and then yeah, after that we're pretty much ready to chuck the motor in. We of course do have to move the brake line, otherwise we'll hit on the aircon bracket, which doesn't need to move very far. We'll probably drop it down about 100 mil, and that'll resolve any issues. If you're unsure about it, look, cut it off with the grinder, and then leave it until you've actually got the aircon and the motor back in the vehicle. That will enable you to position it in a spot that is going to give you plenty of room and plenty of access. So we might even go down that path today, and I'll try and mark exactly the perfect location to put the bracket for when you guys do your conversions. Right, well, I'm going to jump in the engine bay and rip this bell housing off. Keep watching, I suppose. Yeah, I'll speed up so it's not too long of a process. Now be warned, the bell housing is quite heavy, so either have something down there to catch it or be prepared to put it somewhere. So yeah, don't drop it. Side note, before you take this off, make sure that you have drained your gearbox, otherwise things are going to get real messy. Going to want to grab either a flat blade, razor blade, or some sort of scraper, and we're going to have to clean this surface up. Don't pull on anything, just make sure that everything's still sitting nice and engaged. You will get a bit of oil weeping. We left this draining overnight, and as you can see, it's still dripping. However, we aren't going to be putting the bell housing on just yet. We'll move over and start on the brake lines and on the fuel lines. So we'll keep this video in chronological order, and I'll jump over there. I'll get rid of these gloves, clean up that mess, and yeah, we'll start making progress on that. Beautiful, guys. Thanks heaps. Now, brake lines and fuel lines seem to be a extremely hot topic when it comes to discussion throughout the forum. And the main issue is obviously once we put the LS in, the extractors are going to run along here, and although we have a heat shield which is going to prevent a lot of heat getting over to the fuel lines and over to the brake lines, we still need to move them out the way so that we don't run into dramas in regards to boiling of brake fluid or of course boiling of fuel. So what we do is we remove the shield down here, we take the two brackets off that are holding the lines, and we will actually reroute the brake lines over the top of the chassis and then attach them to the body with P-clips. And then the fuel lines will reshape and move to the top of the chassis rail, and then that will flow into the Mark's four-wheel drive pressure adapter and fuel filter setup. So I'll go grab some tools and we'll get stuck into that one. Well, actually, alright, so we've got all those out. So as we can see, the lines are nice and loose. What we want to do is we want to remove this bracket here. We will need to put it aside as we'll be reusing it. So just unclip that off the lines. And then these ones down here, same sort of story, just clip them off. Chuck them aside. Look, those ones we're not really going to be reusing, but chuck them aside just for the sake of if you can find a spot that they're going to work nicely, then you're really laughing. Right, so as you can see, all our lines are nice and loose now. For the sake of the video, I'm going to chuck it up in the air on the hoist, just to keep things a bit easier for you guys to see. You certainly don't need a hoist for this. Doing it on jack stands is fine. Just make sure you're using rated jack stands for the weight of the vehicle. So anyway, back in a sec. Right, this is what I like to do. There are going to be plenty of opinions, plenty of people that say, oh, you don't have to do that. Personally, for the time it takes, the simplicity of it, and the guarantee that you are never going to have dramas, this is what I do. Now, most patrols, getting to the age they are, do have sagged body mounts. So what we're going to be doing is taking the line from this mount, shooting over the top of the chassis rail. At this point here, there's a natural body fold, and it enables us to get over to this side. As you can see that gap, we're going to bring our line out through here and then shoot him back up over to here. Is it overkill? Possibly. Do you really want to have brake fade when you're on the beach or, you know, going down a big hill? Not really. So personally, even though it might be a bit of extra work, I recommend it. It is definitely worth it. The one you may have drama with is getting the line through here, especially if your body mounts have sagged. You can put a pry bar in there and just gently move the body up a little bit. That will enable you to squeeze these two brake lines through. Keep in mind we are only doing it for the two brake lines. The fuel lines we'll get to shortly. This is how I like to do the brake lines. By all means, if you aren't confident or you don't like the way it's done, that's fine. I'm more than happy for you to do it your way. But this gets the brake lines out the way so that the fuel lines can run on top of the chassis. So it squeezes through there, it comes over to this side, I use a PS00 hose clamp from Narva and pre-drill the chassis and put some Tex screws in there. Once I've manipulated the lines so that there are no lines touching at any point, I then double check that there are no lines touching, especially through this area of the chassis. As you can see, 5mm of clearance both sides. If you do need to adjust it, grab a flathead screwdriver and ever so slightly bend it to where it needs to be. Once again, you are moving your brake lines around. Please ensure that there is nothing rubbing anywhere. That's the underside of the brake lines. I'll drop the car back down and I'll show you the top half of the brake lines. Then we can get the fuel filter assembly in and yeah, move on to getting the motor ready. Fuel pressure and fuel filter setup. Really easy to get going. I need I reckon it's a 3mm Allen key, a shifter, a flat blade screwdriver. We use Loctite 567 or Worth pipe sealant just for a bit of sealing around the flanges, and threads. So really simple with this one. Long barb goes down at the bottom. That's going to be your fuel return back to the fuel tank. With thread sealant, you don't need a whole heap, as they are a taper sealing thread. They do need to be snugged up quite nicely. And grab hold of the block and snug him down. Now, next one, your right angle piece, which is your 3/8 barb. Same again, into the fitting. As it goes in, you can see it's dragging that sealant down anyway. Once again, we're going to snug him up. When we snug this one up, we ideally want to stop in the downward position so that it is pointing our fuel filter. If you need to, go and chuck it in the vise ever so gently, maybe with some soft jaws, and get him pointing in the right direction. Once she's pointing down, as you can see, if we were to put that on the bracket, it should line up beautifully with where the filter's going. Last but not least, we have the fitting that will accept the Holden's EFI single feed fuel line, and we're going to nip that one in and tighten him down. At this point, you can grab the smaller of the two fuel lines and feed him onto the bottom. When I put my hose clamps on, I like to have them facing obviously away from the bracket, just for the simple case of if we ever have to work on it in the future, you don't have to remove this all from the bracket to do so. Next step is to get the next piece of fuel on and place him onto the barb as well with the hose clamp. Now, Marks provide you with EFI fuel hose clamps. If you go in when you need to get into the fuel system at a later point, which we'll cover quite shortly, we want to be making sure we're buying EFI hose clamps. They've got a secondary band around to stop the band of the hose clamp digging in and cutting into the fuel line. So we want to make sure we're using that. Now, the next thing we're going to do is take our fuel filter, look for the out, and we're going to sit him just on there, nice and gently, and take our big hose clamp, loosen him open, and this big hose clamp wraps around the filter, just like so, and that is going to hold it in place. Now, don't do the fuel filter up just yet. We want to snug him down so it's sort of getting close, but not quite tight, because that will lead us into the next step. Now it's snug, but as you can see, I can move it still properly now for the moment. Take our fuel pressure regulator and our screws and just screw them onto the bracket like so. Once you get both in and snug down, tighten them up. Now, this line here, he's happy. He's happy to be that length. This one here, what we're going to do, we're going to take our filter, put our filter back into the bracketry, and push him in. Now, you want to make sure that the filter's sitting back a little bit, because if you cut it with the filter sitting in the middle, it is going to hit on the barb and it will not work. So find your line that you think will work. As always, leave a bit extra if you think you're going to need it. And snip him down. The next one's completely optional, but I find it really easy. I always use silicone spray, especially when I'm trying to get barbs or fittings or the like to go over. Barbs or fittings or the like to go over something that's quite tight. Make sure you loosen off your hose clamps too. It does make that little bit of difference. And personally, I like to have them facing the same way. A bit OCD, but it just makes that bit of difference. Now this is the reason why I don't want to do the hose clamp up too much. Back him off a bit. Big old push. And when you get that big old push happening, you'll actually get it up and over that lip, ensuring you're not going to have issues with any fuel lines blowing off in the future. I have seen other kits that don't have this filter, so they don't have the lip, and as a result I have unfortunately seen fuel lines blow off a vehicle before, which, as you can imagine, with fuel and being as close to the exhaust as it is, it's not fun at all. Now we can snug down that one. Take our last bit of hose, put our hose clamp on. Slide on that bit more. Bit of spray, once again, down the tube. So, top half of the fuel lines. What you need to do is ever so gently bend these brake loops backwards and push these lines underneath the booster. You will then feed your fuel lines to the other side of the steering shaft. And then what I do is I take the original clamp, place it down near the chassis, and then use the original plastic ones just to work like line spacers. Now you're at the point where you can take your fuel bracket. It's really hard to do one-handed. Slide him down and we can measure out our fuel lines. As you can see, this one once again is going to get cut short, and this one's pretty much the right length. So I like to cut them down if I need to take anything off, which actually, you know what, I reckon I'm going to take a couple of mil off this one. Cut them down and then slide them on and then secure the bracket. So we'll go ahead and do that. Now that that's in there and that's secure, we can do our final check. So you can see this fuel line's a little bit close. So if you're very, very gentle, you can just ever so slightly move them with your hands, and they will happily bend out the way. So we're now going to check all our lines. A good test is giving them a flick. It'll pretty much highlight any issues, any points that they're touching each other. I'm really happy with how that's looking. I'm going to try and slide him up so that we don't have any dramas at all. Just want a little push down. Yeah. And you can see we have great clearance on all the lines. No dramas at all, no chance of it's hitting the steering rack, and we are looking great. Probably my only gripe with this bracket setup is the fact that this line comes down on a bit of an angle, and it does make it quite difficult to get the original fuse box cover back on. It's not a really big problem, but yeah, just one of those things. It would be good if they gave it a bit more of a kick, just so it had a bit more clearance. Other than that, we are ready to move on to installation of these mounts. Is really, really easy. What you're going to do is you want to center your plate. You'll notice you have two plates. The one with right hand goes on the right hand, the one with left hand goes on the left hand. The one on the right hand is a little bit different to the one on the left hand in the matter of the one on the left hand, you're only drilling one hole. The one on the right hand requires you to notch a little bit out of the mount. Now, you can use a die grinder for this, that'll do the job fine. We like to use these Ferd Polycurve grinding flat wheels. They get in there, they get it out really, really quickly. Leaves it with a nice clean area to work with very little burrs. While we've got the grinder out, we're going to cut this mount off, and we're going to relocate him down to roughly around here. So I'll get into that, we'll mark those. One thing I like to use is a transfer punch. A transfer punch is basically the exact same size punch as the hole you're going to drill. It then has a center point on it, and it lines up your drill hole pilot perfectly. So we will use a paint marker pen to mark our little notch, and yeah, we'll go from there. With the bracket, just aim for the center, mark him up so we know we're taking that out, and we'll grab our hammer and put a mark on there. We'll now do the same on the passenger side. We are good to drill. We'll go ahead. The other thing we're required to do is cut across the top of here and up through here to ensure there's clearance for the headers and the engine mount. As you can see, got it hold, got it notched out. What we'll now do is take our mount, dome towards the inside, just like so. Take our notched plate, slide the notched plate up like so. Now we're using the gold flanged nuts. They're an 18mm, and we're gonna get that in nice and tight and tighten them down. Same again on the passenger side. Take that mount, dome side in, take our piece, slide it on up to 18mm. And then what I do is, when I'm tightening up the nuts, I like to push the mount towards the chassis to ensure that you've got a nice snug fit. Once again, nice and tight, so that there is no chance of anything coming undone in the future. That's our engine mounts done. They're ready to rock and roll. You don't need to give them a tighten or a move. Just loose the belts off, give them a whack around to where you need to, and then snug them back up. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to go and grab a razor blade and clean up any silicone or leftover mess on the front of that gearbox. We'll then go over the bell housing, insert the seal, and put the bell housing and adapter shaft on.